10:17 p.m. The house had grown quiet, but there was one thought Uchendu Ozokwor could not easily push from his mind. His mother, Patience Ozokwor, was now 67 years old. To millions of viewers, she was still Mama G, the fierce woman whose voice could dominate a scene, whose stare alone could silence a room, and whose unforgettable performances made her appear almost indestructible. But away from the cameras, costumes, and applause, time was writing a different story across her face. At 67, every year carries a reminder that even the strongest body cannot remain untouched by age. For Uchendu and the rest of the family, that realization could be deeply unsettling. The woman they had always known as the center of the family was growing older before their eyes. A slower step after a demanding day, a longer pause between activities, silver strands of hair, old photographs showing the distance between yesterday and today. None of these details should automatically be interpreted as evidence of disease, yet together they create an uncomfortable portrait of time moving forward. And this is where rumors surrounding Patience's health can become especially painful. Claims that she is suffering from terminal cancer or enduring the final stages of the disease should not be presented as fact without reliable confirmation. According to publicly available information, there is no solid basis for turning Patience's life at 67 into a story of confirmed terminal cancer, no matter how dramatic such a claim might sound. The more truthful emotional story lies elsewhere, in the fear that comes when an adult son begins looking at his mother differently. Uchendu once looked upward and saw someone who seemed capable of surviving anything. She was the mother who endured hardship, carried responsibilities, built a remarkable career, and kept moving through personal loss. Now the roles are slowly shifting. The child has become a grown man, and the mother he once believed would remain unchanged forever carries the unmistakable marks of age. Perhaps that is what hurts most, not a diagnosis that has never been reliably established, but the knowledge that no amount of fame, money, love, or family devotion can negotiate with time. Old age does not always announce itself dramatically. Sometimes it enters quietly, through a photograph held a few seconds longer than usual, through the changing face reflected in a mirror, through a son noticing details he ignored years before. And for Patience, the idea of human fragility is hardly unfamiliar. Long before the world began watching Mama G grow older, she had already been forced to look directly at loss inside her own family. Somewhere in that silent house, beneath the photographs of happier years, there remained a memory that time had never completely erased. Long before the name Mama G became synonymous with strength, confrontation, and authority, Patience Ozokwor was simply a young woman trying to build a family and understand what it meant to become a wife and mother. She married at a young age and eventually had 3 biological children, entering a chapter of life that initially seemed far removed from the dramatic characters millions would later associate with her face. But family life would bring a kind of struggle no script could control. Patience has spoken about a difficult period beginning when her husband became seriously ill. What followed was not one dramatic night, but a prolonged experience of uncertainty. A family living beside sickness, watching someone they loved struggle while ordinary life still demanded attention. For Patience, there was no director waiting to shout, "Cut," when the emotional weight became unbearable. She was a wife watching her partner's strength diminish while also remaining a mother whose children still needed stability. That helplessness may be one of the cruelest parts of prolonged illness. Love can make you stay beside someone, care for them, pray for them, and search desperately for hope. But love cannot always command a body to recover. Her husband continued battling illness before eventually passing away in 2000, leaving Patience a widow and changing the structure of the family forever. Years later, audiences would watch Mama G enter a room and seemingly control everyone around her. She could shout, threaten, fight back, and appear impossible to defeat. Yet behind that commanding screen presence stood a woman who had once confronted something she could not control at all: the declining health of someone she loved. That contrast makes her story far more painful than any unverified claim about Patience herself suffering from terminal cancer. Her real history already contains loss. After her husband's death, there were children to raise, responsibilities to carry, and an empty space in the family that success could never completely replace. From the children's perspective, especially Uchendu's, their mother was no longer merely the woman who comforted them. She was now carrying burdens that had once belonged to two parents. He could watch her continue moving forward, perhaps without fully understanding how much grief was hidden behind that determination. A child sees his mother standing and assumes she is strong enough to stand forever. Decades later, that image becomes painfully different. The boy becomes a man. The mother grows older, and somewhere among the family's old photographs remains the image of a younger Uchendu looking toward Patience as she carried the family forward, neither of them yet knowing that one day he would be the one watching her footsteps become older with time. Sometimes tragedy is not simply that one person falls, but that the person left behind must wake up the next morning and somehow continue living as though the world has not changed. For Patience Ozokwor, the death of her husband in 2000 did not mark the end of grief. In many ways, it marked the beginning of a different kind of loneliness. The funeral could end, visitors could return home, and the noise surrounding loss could gradually disappear. But there was still a family waiting for her. Patience did not remarry. Instead, she poured much of herself into her children, her work, and her faith, carrying forward a life that now had one unmistakable absence. Uchendu, Chioma, and the other members of the family became part of the reason she had to keep moving, even on days when memories pulled her backward. Years later, Patience would speak about missing the companionship of her husband and wishing he had lived long enough to see what she eventually accomplished. That thought reveals a quieter side of Mama G that audiences rarely encountered on screen. Imagine reaching milestones you once dreamed about, hearing applause, receiving recognition, and watching strangers celebrate your success, only to realize that the person with whom you would most want to share that moment is no longer sitting beside you. Success arrived, but grief did not politely leave when it did. Her name became recognizable far beyond her home. Audiences embraced the formidable characters she portrayed, and Mama G gradually became one of the faces associated with Nollywood itself. Yet every achievement carried a cruel contradiction. The higher Patience climbed, the more there was for her late husband to have witnessed. There could be photographs, awards, crowded events, and people calling her name, while in the private geography of memory, one chair remained empty. Her children saw another side of that journey. Uchendu and Chioma were not simply watching an actress become famous, they were watching their mother rebuild a life after losing her partner. Perhaps this is why the story of Patience growing older carries such emotional weight today. Her children know that the powerful woman audiences see has already survived years that demanded far more courage than any movie role. She had buried someone she expected to grow old beside, raised a family through that absence, and continued walking toward a future she could not yet see. And then, almost unexpectedly, the doors of that future began opening. Cameras appeared, scripts arrived. Her face reached millions of homes. The widow who had learned to live beside an empty chair was about to become Mama G, and neither Patience nor her children could yet understand just how completely that name would transform their lives. Then the rhythm changed. The woman who had learned to carry grief quietly began stepping into a world where everything was louder. The stage, radio, television, and eventually the rapidly expanding Nigerian film industry. Patience Ozokwor's path toward Nollywood was not an overnight transformation. Years of performance and broadcasting gradually prepared her for the moment when cameras would turn her into something larger than herself. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, audiences were beginning to recognize that face. Then came the characters that would define her public image: the intimidating mother-in-law, the controlling matriarch, the powerful woman who could destroy an opponent with a sentence, the villain whose entrance alone could change the atmosphere of an entire scene. Mama G was born. Viewers loved her, feared her, argued about her characters, and sometimes found it difficult to separate the actress from the women she portrayed. But every time Patience walked onto a set, another story followed silently behind her. The story of a mother who had already watched illness affect her family, lost her husband, and continued raising her children while rebuilding a life that had been torn apart. Recognition eventually became impossible to ignore. Major honors followed, including Africa Movie Academy Award recognition, national acknowledgement among prominent Nigerians, and decades later an Industry Merit Award at the 2023 Africa Magic Viewers' Choice Awards. Yet the trophies tell only half the story. After the lights dimmed and the cameras stopped, Mama G disappeared and Patience returned home. Uchendu, Chioma, and the family did not simply see a Nollywood icon walking through the door. They saw their mother, the same woman who had endured the empty chair left by their father and somehow continued forward. And therein lies the unsettling contradiction. The more famous Patience became, the more invincible Mama G appeared to the public. On screen, she could fight, command, threaten, and survive almost anything the script placed in front of her. Outside the screen, however, time recognized no celebrity. It did not care about awards, applause, or millions of viewers. Years continued accumulating quietly. The young wife became a widow. The struggling performer became an icon, the children became adults, and the face audiences had known for decades slowly began carrying the visible history of those decades. For Uchendu, perhaps that transformation was impossible to ignore. The world could continue seeing Mama G as timeless, replaying old films in which she looked exactly as she had years earlier. But a son does not live inside a replay. He sees birthdays arrive. He sees old photographs becoming increasingly distant from the present. And while the cameras preserved Mama G almost forever, outside the frame, Patience Ozokwor continued walking toward something no powerful character she had ever played could defeat: time itself. 67. Just 2 digits, yet behind them stands an entire lifetime. Born on September 14, 1958, Patience Ozokwor is now 67. And suddenly the greatest opponent in this story is not a villain, a cruel mother-in-law, a betrayal, or even one of the dramatic enemies Mama G has defeated countless times on screen. It is time. There is no reliable public evidence that Patience is battling terminal cancer, suffering a stroke, or facing another specific life-threatening diagnosis, and inventing such an illness would obscure the far more human reality already in front of us. Aging itself forces even the strongest people to reconsider how much their bodies can carry and how quickly the years are passing. Think about what those 67 years contain. Marriage at a young age, motherhood, children depending on her, a husband enduring prolonged illness, widowhood, grief, work, radio, television, stages and film sets, scripts arriving one after another, long days under lights, journeys away from home, emotional performances, public appearances, and decades of carrying the expectations attached to the name Mama G. A younger body can sometimes treat exhaustion like an inconvenience. An older body demands that it be heard. Patience has previously spoken about paying attention to what her body needs, including her diet, eating fruit, and exercising when necessary. Those ordinary choices suddenly carry a different meaning when viewed through the lens of age. They are not proof of illness. They are reminders that maintaining health becomes increasingly precious as the decades accumulate. And perhaps nobody feels that passage of time quite like a child watching a parent grow older. Uchendu once stood on the protected side of their relationship. His mother worried about him, guided him, and carried responsibilities he could not yet understand. Now he is an adult with a life and family of his own, while Patience stands at 67 with an entire history written behind her. The direction of concern begins to change. A son may start asking whether his mother is resting enough, whether she is taking on too much, whether there will always be another birthday, another family photograph, another conversation postponed until tomorrow. That is where age becomes frightening. Not because 67 automatically means sickness, but because it destroys the comforting illusion that families have unlimited time. Mama G can remain forever fierce inside an old movie. The scene can be replayed 10 times, 100 times, and she will never grow a day older. Uchendu does not have that luxury with his mother. Outside the screen, the clock continues moving, and somewhere late at night, while an old Mama G film can still be paused with the touch of a button, Patience's real life continues forward toward a future that no one in the family can pause. For years, Uchendu stood on the other side of this story. He was the child. Patience was the mother who seemed to know what to do when something went wrong, the woman standing between her children and whatever uncertainty waited outside the family home. But children do not remain children, and parents do not remain frozen in the age their sons and daughters remember most clearly. Uchendu grew up, built his own life, and started a family of his own. And somewhere during that transformation, an uncomfortable reversal quietly began. The son who once needed protecting could now look toward the woman who protected him and realize that she, too, was growing older. There is no need to invent a story about Uchendu receiving devastating news that his mother has terminal cancer. There is no reliable public basis for such a scene. The emotional truth is simpler and perhaps more unsettling. When parents age, ordinary moments begin changing value. A phone call that once felt routine becomes something worth answering. A meal around the same table becomes harder to dismiss as there will always be another one. A visit postponed because work is busy suddenly carries a question nobody wants to say aloud. How many more times will everyone be together exactly like this? Time has a strange way of betraying childhood memories. In Uchendu's mind, Patience can still exist as the tireless mother moving through the house, solving problems, carrying responsibilities, and refusing to surrender when life became difficult. But then reality interrupts that memory. The calendar has moved forward by decades. Look at an old photograph of mother and son. Uchendu is younger, perhaps standing close to the woman who represented safety itself. Move to another photograph years later, and he is taller, older, more independent. Another picture appears, another birthday passes, another family gathering is preserved. Uchendu keeps growing into the man he is becoming. But something else is happening inside those same photographs. Patience is changing too. The face remains unmistakably hers, yet the years begin leaving their quiet signatures. That may be time's deepest betrayal. It allows children to keep a permanent version of their parents inside their memories while changing those parents relentlessly in the real world. And for Uchendu, the woman standing before him today is both people at once. Mama G, the seemingly indestructible icon known across Nigeria, and simply his mother, now 67, whose presence can never be treated as infinite. Somewhere in the family collection there may be photographs separated by 20 or 30 years, and if they were placed side by side, the story would need no words. The little boy becomes a man, the mother becomes older, and between the two pictures lies an invisible distance that neither of them can ever walk backward. But perhaps the reason 67 feels different has very little to do with the number itself. It has everything to do with what this family has already lost. Long before Patience Ozokwor reached this stage of life, she knew what it meant to watch the shape of a family change forever. Her husband became ill. The difficult years stretched on. Patience remained beside her children while carrying responsibilities that could not simply be postponed. Then, in 2000, her husband died. One person disappeared from the family's everyday life, but his absence did not disappear with him. Patience has spoken publicly about missing her husband's companionship and wishing he had been alive to witness what she later achieved. That is the real wound in this story. It does not require an invented cancer diagnosis. It does not require an intensive care room, an oxygen mask, or a doctor delivering terrible news. The loss was already real. Now imagine the timelines crossing. A younger Patience is at home, surrounded by children, trying to keep a family moving through uncertainty. Years pass. Another Patience stands beneath studio lights, transforming into Mama G, while cameras capture the fierce expression that millions will remember. Time moves again. She walks onto stages to receive recognition for a career built across decades. Applause fills the room. People rise. Cameras flash. Yet somewhere inside those moments is the thought she has expressed before. The man who once shared her life is not there to see it. Then the image changes again. Patience today. 67 years old. Children grown. Grandchildren around her. A career behind her that once seemed unimaginable. The noise becomes quieter now. 67 is not a sentence. It is not a diagnosis. It is not evidence that something terrible is about to happen. Patience should not be described as dying of cancer or another serious disease without credible evidence. But 67 is old enough to make the people who love someone understand that time deserves more respect than it once received. Uchendu knows what his family has already experienced. Patience knows it even more deeply. She has lived through the moment when someone who had occupied an ordinary place in everyday life suddenly existed instead in photographs and memories. Perhaps that is why another family meal matters, another conversation matters, another photograph matters. The younger Patience once held her children close because they needed her. Mama G later stood before millions because audiences wanted her. And now, at 67, Patience can simply sit among the people who know the woman behind the character. Somewhere nearby, an old family photograph may still contain her husband, Patience, and their younger children together, a frozen moment from a time when none of them yet understood how quickly an ordinary family picture could become something precious. 10:17 p.m. We are back exactly where this story began. The house is quiet again. An old Mama G movie has just ended, and for a few seconds the television screen holds the final image before fading completely to black. No hospital room, no doctor waiting behind a closed door, no oxygen machine, no terminal cancer diagnosis, no family preparing to say goodbye. Just silence, and perhaps, somewhere on a nearby table, an old family photograph. Patience is younger in that picture. Her children are smaller. Uchendu is still a boy who cannot possibly imagine himself as a grown man looking back at this moment decades later. And Patience's husband is still there, occupying a place inside the frame that life would eventually leave empty. Nobody in that photograph knows what is coming. They do not know about the years of illness her husband will endure, the grief Patience will carry after his death, the films she will make, the characters audiences will fear, the recognition she will receive, or the extraordinary weight the name Mama G will eventually carry. They are simply a family standing together while the camera freezes a fraction of their lives. Outside that photograph, everything has changed. Those children grew up. Uchendu built his own path and family. Patience became one of Nollywood's most recognizable faces, and now she is 67. Not a woman defined by a rumored disease, but a woman standing in another chapter, the chapter of age, memory, and the quiet awareness that time has been moving even when nobody was watching it. Perhaps what frightens a child most is not always hearing a doctor name an illness. Sometimes it is simply the moment they look at their mother's face for a little longer than usual and suddenly realize time has been there all along. Uchendu can remember the mother who seemed incapable of becoming tired. Audiences can replay Mama G and see the same fierce woman preserved forever on screen. But real life has no replay button. Patience has already learned that more painfully than most. She once expected to grow older beside her husband, only to continue the journey without him. Now the years have brought her children and grandchildren into a different season of family life, one in which an ordinary conversation, an unexpected laugh, or another photograph together can quietly become more valuable than an award. The imaginary camera slowly moves away from Patience's face. It passes the dark television and stops on that old photograph. Everyone inside it is still young. Nobody moves. Nobody knows what happens next. And somewhere in the corner of the room, unseen but impossible to silence, the clock keeps ticking.